So it looks like we're going to be hanging out inside for at least a little while longer, and with the colder months coming up fast, there's never been a more perfect time to stock up on all your comfy clothes. Lucky for you, you listen to the Choose Your Struggle podcast, and I have a sweet deal for you today. Check out my sponsor, Pair of Thieves. They've got everything you need, from shorts to lounge pants to underwear and bras. They even have a line of Disney socks with all your favorite characters on it. But here's the best part. If you use the link in the show notes or on my podcast website and the discount code Rakuten Thieves, don't worry, that's in the show notes too, you'll get 20% off every full price item in your shopping cart. So stock up on all your comfy clothes today and help out the podcast in the process.
But I'm going to just go ahead and invite Jay Shifman up to share his story. So let's give it up for Jay.
Welcome to the Choose Your Struggle podcast. I am your host, Jay Shifman. Hey y'all, there is some great things happening as we prepare for season 2. Perfect example, everybody on Patreon is getting a sneak peek at the new theme song this week. The first interviews for next season are being recorded in the next week. It is an awesome time for the podcast. But we still don't have new episodes. That's not going to be for another couple weeks. So in the meantime, enjoy this awesome special episode. It's me chatting with Luke West of the Imperfect pod. We had a really good conversation. We didn't agree on everything, but we came at this from a similar point of view. And because of it, we really got deep and we really touched on some things that people need to hear. So enjoy this special episode, and I will talk to y'all next week. Are you ready to take your hemp experience to a whole new level? Because if so, I want to tell you about my sponsor, Mountain Made. Their puff line of smokable flower is unreal. They meticulously source each strain from select partner farms to ensure only the highest quality product in the marketplace. When it comes to the entourage effect, nothing tops strain-specific flower. It delivers the full range of all the amazing effects of CBD. I can tell you because I use it myself. With 0.7 grams of premium full flower inside of each pre-roll, you'll be ready to maximize your personal summit whenever you smoke. So check out Mountain Made today and grab a puff. They're federally compliant with less than 0.3% THC, which means they ship nationwide. All right, I'm gonna grab a puff and let's get back to the episode.
Our emotions are designed to inform us, not to direct us.
There is no number you're ever going to get to that is going to heal whatever is going on inside of you.
I think defining what it means to be a man is not possible. And when I say I don't think it's possible, I mean on a mass scale of agreement throughout societies.
Oftentimes, anger is simply sadness masked.
Because I feel like you never really stop growing. And if you have stopped growing, you're already dead in the water. Stagnation is synonymous to death.
You are now embarking on the Imperfect experience. Hello, Imperfect listeners. It's your host, Luke West, back with another episode where we discuss masculinity and manhood more intentionally and purposefully. On this episode, my guest is Jay Shifman, and we talk about substance abuse versus misuse, mental health in male communities, why it's hard for men to open up, why we need to have conversations about suicide, and what society can do to make it easier for men to have these conversations. Jay is a mental health and substance misuse and recovery speaker, coach, and advocate, and his goal is to normalize conversations around these topics to make people's lives clearer. Jay has went through his own struggles, including medication misuse, suicide attempts, overdoses, and more. He now runs his podcast, Choose Your Struggle, to help normalize these conversations about mental health, and you can find these on any streaming platform. As it's currently November and a month about men's mental health, I thought this would be an important episode to share with you during this time. Also, you can find a link to my friend Gautham's Movember fundraiser in the description of this episode. You can also check out my episode with Gautam, which was the first podcast episode I ever produced and released. So go back if you want to check that out. But let's get into this week's episode now. Okay, Imperfect listeners, I am here with Jay Shifman here today. Funny story, he knows Amanda Webster from a few episodes back. The podcasting world is small, so that is fantastic. We just had a little chuckle about that. But Jay, I'm excited for you to be here.
Yeah, Luke, thanks so much for having me, man. This is wonderful. And Amanda, how are you? No, I don't pass up an opportunity to chat about issues of mental health, substance misuse, because, as your listeners will hear soon, I live these issues, and I truly believe that we need all hands on deck. That the more of us that are talking about normalization of discussing these issues at the very least, the more that we can do about actually getting the help for people who need that help and deserve the help.
Yeah. Well, Jay, that's a fantastic intro. And the first question I always ask my guests is, who is one person, dead or alive, that you'd like to have over for dinner, and what we should cook for them? Is it the same person that you were talking to me about before the podcast, or is it someone completely different?
Oh man, no, that's funny. For your listeners, we were talking about Stephen Page of the Bare Naked Ladies, who's on my list. People I really want to interview. That list is getting pretty long now. If any of you listeners happen to know Kesha, please send her my way. That would be wonderful. No, I would say that the answer to that is twofold. Number one, I in the last year lost both of my grandfathers, and so I think that if given the opportunity to sit down with the two of them again, obviously that would be number one. Both are missed and had a big impact on my life, but sort of reaching for the stars a little bit, I believe that one of the most influential people in my life, who has no idea because he's been dead for a long time, is George Harrison of the Beatles. I am just such a big fan of his music, but more than that, George was sort of open about his own mental health struggles, and very famously, that's why the Beatles stopped touring, because George Harrison basically said to him, "You got two choices: keep me in the band and stop touring, or find a new guitar player." So, I really admire him as a person and his music, and would love to sit down and chat with George. He probably would have no interest, but I would love to sit down and chat with him.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the way that if you approach a conversation, and this is something Amanda and I were talking about too, is if you approach the situation or conversation the right way, you can sit down with anyone. It just matters about what your intent is. Because if you're like, "Hey, George, I want to sit down with you because you're cool," probably wouldn't work. But if you're like, "I'm fascinated by your mental health journey," it's probably a little bit more chance there that you might get that dinner.
So it's funny because, yes, you're 100% right. And as my friends will tell you, I'm one of those people that I'll tell you a story and you'll be like, there's no way that's true. I'm really lucky. I've been really lucky in my life, with everything that I'm about to talk about, notwithstanding. But I've had the chance to really get to know some truly incredible people. I'm not going to name drop or anything, but you're 100% right. A lot of it is just approaching people as people and not, causing them to run the other way when you fanboy, fangirl, whatever the case is. So, there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. And obviously getting into a little bit more about your story, you run a podcast called Choose Your Struggle. I'm really curious, what does Choose Your Struggle mean in the story of your life?
That's a great question. Choose Your Struggle is my brand overall. So it's the name of my business. It's the name of my podcast. It's kind of my personal hashtag and my own mantra. Essentially, what Choose Your Struggle means is, all too often we are following these paths forward that, whether we are aware of it or not, we haven't chosen, right? Circumstances chosen for us. For a lot of people, mommy or daddy said you're going to be a doctor, and so now you're a doctor, and you've never really liked being a doctor, but you're a doctor. For your listeners, by the way, I'm Jewish, and some stereotypes are true. Jewish mother. A lot of us do things because our mother decides it's what we're going to do before birth. But these things will never bring us happiness. I hate to sort of lay it out there like that. But the fact is, a lot of people get to the end of their lives and they're like, wow, that just, I did a lot of things that did not bring me joy. And quite frankly, some things we have to do, they don't bring us joy. I run my own business. I hate editing my podcast. I hate doing the books on my business. It's not fun, but I like what comes of it, right? So it's worth it to me. But that being said, if you are sort of one of those people that's, unfortunately working for the weekend, right? Or if you are slaving so that you can afford the best of life for your family, but you never see your family, like, is that truly what is going to bring you the most joy? Probably not. So choose your struggle means, look, we're all going to struggle. You accept that as part of life. Make sure you are at least in charge of what you can be in charge of. And that comes from me. I'm now going on 11 years in recovery from a pretty serious issue with substance misuse that saw me in a year span. I'm going to lay this out here, right? From the summer of 2009 to the spring of 2010, saw me attempt suicide twice, overdose once, spend a night in the hospital going through overdose, spend the next 3 weeks in a lockdown unit, the kind of place where, you're walking around without a belt on or shoelaces, and then spend 3 months in a long-term care facility before finally going through another 3+ months of detox. So that was a pretty hellacious year. And at that time, and leading up to that, I didn't get to choose what I struggled for, right? Getting out of bed, getting off the couch, avoiding withdrawals, because I was at a point in my life where if I woke up and didn't immediately reach for the drugs, I was going to spend my morning going through withdrawals. That's just the way that my body was working at the time. Those were my struggles. Those are pretty terrible struggles. And I didn't get to choose that for myself. That was the way that my life had gone. Now, I'm almost 11 years in recovery. I get to choose what I struggle for, and you're hearing it, you're seeing it. This is my struggle.
What's your anniversary date? I'm interested.
Yeah, so I don't have. I have an anniversary a month because. So sort of big picture, because this could get really nitty gritty, but I am not sober. I am in recovery. I'm not sober. Thankfully, I never struggled with alcohol. And at the time that I got into recovery, and again, my story is super convoluted. I didn't identify as being in recovery for that first, whatever period. I identified because I'd been told for a long time that I was severely mentally ill. That's what I'd been told for a long time. And I get off the medication, and it wasn't like I was doing this through AA where people were telling me, hey, man, remember this date. This isn't, whatever. I was doing this completely alone. So that was March of 2010. So I celebrate that as my recovery anniversary, is that month. Okay. I don't know the date. It was sometime late March. That's the best I can do.
Perfect. And I'm really interested. You say substance misuse, not abuse. What is the difference there?
So that's a great question. Thank you for asking me that. I was going to bring that up later, so we can cut right to it now.
Yeah.
So substance misuse is the way that a lot of us are going with that verbiage, and the reason is substance abuse is a word that has a lot of connotation. The word abuse, right? When you think of abuse, it's a pretty horrible act. Usually, if they're using the word abuse, something horrible is happening, right? Substance misuse is much more to the point, which is that you are misusing a substance. And the added bonus to that phrase is that it implies that there is a safe use of that substance. So for those people like me who truly believe that drugs can be used safely, and that drugs have gotten a bad rap for a long time in the United States, using the word substance misuse says, number one, what I was doing was wrong. I was misusing it, but it wasn't the drugs' fault. Heroin, I was never on heroin, but heroin can occasionally be used safely. So can a lot of things. There are ways to misuse a lot of things. There are also ways to use them safely. So that's sort of the break. And you're seeing a lot more people using substance misuse as a way of trying to get away from the word abuse.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like I've heard the language change and things like it's people experiencing homelessness, not a homeless person. Like you put the struggle
That's
after the
right.
human side of it, right?
Or
So I'm
somebody
really
struggling with addiction instead of an
yeah.
addict. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And it's just like a little bit more human way of approaching the
that's
conversation.
right.
So one thing I'm really interested in then, because I'm really interested in this idea of sedation or over sedation. That seems to be a common problem with a lot of young men right now. Studies are coming out, how the school system is over sedating young boys who are hyper and ADHD. And I know that misdiagnosis is part of your journey. So why don't you talk a little bit about sedation, over sedation, and just misdiagnosis in general? I know that's kind of a huge topic, but I'm interested.
It's one that I've talked a lot about. I will say right off the bat, I have my own experience, and I have now done about 5 years of research into this. Somebody joked with me not long ago that if I had just done all this work through a university, I would have my doctorate by now. But I do this work because it's fascinating to me, right? I went back and got my degree in psychology as a way of trying to understand what was done to me, and obviously I didn't figure that out, so I'm still searching. But go read this article, really fascinating article called I think it's the drugging of the American boy. I believe that's the title, and it's all about this, and it's really interesting. Essentially, what happened was I was born in 1986. I'm 34 years old. When I turned 1 year old, 1987, there were roughly 350,000 kids in the U.S. that were treated for ADHD. By the time I was diagnosed in 1997 as an 11-year-old, that number had blossomed to 2 million in a decade. And that's unheard of, right? This is, we look at that in the criminal justice system in the United States, it's almost the same numbers. Like almost literally, there were, roughly 350,000 people in jail in the 80s. By the late 90s, there's 2 million people in jail. And we rightfully look at that and go, well, that's kind of screwed up. Yet we're not looking at that the same way as a culture when it comes to the over medication of mostly young men, but also young women. And that's what was happening. And people, I gave this speech once because I used this data a lot. And someone said to me, oh, but that doesn't happen anymore. And I said, I'm really sorry to burst your bubble. It's 4.5 million now. So it's still happening. And the fact is, it's easier to drug kids who are hyper and quite frankly, some people do need these. I mean, these weren't brought out of nowhere. There is a small group of people who truly benefit from these drugs. But it's easier to make that pool wider and make kids stay in their seats and go through an antiquated and quite frankly out of date education system than it is to change an education system.
Yeah.
So you have kids like me who I was in the 50s you would have called a class clown, right? I was always falling out of my chair. I was in detention all the time as a fifth grader. I just wasn't paying attention because I was a fifth grader and I had a lot of energy. And instead of, schools adapting to this, they just put me on a lot of medication.
And that's like something I find really, really sad, but also interesting. And I'm sure it's a mix of, well, obviously there's been a rise in population during that time. But one of the things that really sticks out to me is I think of it the same way as how when parents, instead of parenting, they just give their kid an iPhone or an iPad, right? Like, okay, this kid wants to go do something, he wants to exert energy, but we'll just give him an iPad. And then that just is another way to not fix the problem, and you're causing like instant gratification problems, obviously. Right. And we blame technology on a lot of these issues when I'm like, I think it's the parents' fault, to be honest. Like, and it's wild.
It's so funny you say that because I had this conversation not long ago where someone was talking about the technology piece, and I said, look, I don't have kids. I am not in any way licensed to tell you you're right or wrong about that. What I am willing to say is a lot of the words you're using to talk about your technology are the same words that were used to talk about the drugs when I was going through this as a kid. So it is very similar. That you make a really great point.
Yeah, and it's like, I think if So for context, I was homeschooled until grade 9. So my mom thinks if I was like in the education system growing up, I would have been ADHD most likely, or diagnosed in that way, because I'm pretty sporadic. I can't really concentrate on a lot of things. And now I would say that's more of a lack of discipline thing than it is like an ADHD thing, but I don't really know. I find it really hard to like focus fully on one thing. And I do think there is an aspect of social media, especially now, kids being raised in that environment, right? But my parents also didn't give us phones and technology on our own until we were like 16, and they never allowed that to be in the house as a way to calm our nerves. And being homeschooled, I was allowed to take breaks whenever I wanted, as long as I was outside and like running around. We had a trampoline, and I like never really thought of those two things or knew it existed until later. And then I'm like, why do all these kids? And then another huge problem is that kids that aren't ADHD take Adderall or Ritalin, or I think those are the two drugs. And I know people that took it in university to study, and I had it offered to me, and I'm like, I will never do that to study, because one, I don't need it, and two, if you don't have really far off like attention spans, it's damaging to you.
Yeah, I think I am sure that at some point we're going to look back as a culture and say, oh, this was to be the first signs of X, right? Whether it's evolution, whether it's de-evolution, whatever the case is, there is clearly a shift happening in our own development. And instead of trying to sort of keep up with that, what we're doing is saying we can't change these systems, which is false. It just takes a lot of work. So we're going to force people through them and do whatever we have to do to get them to get through that. And that's both the education system and the way that work is done today, right? I mean, I actually sat down with my dad's a CEO, and I sat down with him for my podcast not long ago. And we were talking about this exact topic in the terms of the workplace. And he said that, they went to offering people to work remotely, at least part of the time, a while back. And he had people in his company going, oh, this isn't going to work. My employees will just be, whatever, taking time off, not doing anything. And he said the opposite was true. He said we couldn't get people to turn off their computers. They were working too hard. So it's this idea that the way it worked for me has to work for everyone. And instead of going, everybody is different, and we as a culture are changing all the time. Whether it's, again, evolution or take it whatever you will, but things change. Things are constantly in motion. That's the way our world works. And if you don't keep changing with it, you're going to get left behind. And I think we're seeing that as, sadly, here in the United States, our education continues to plummet, right? Our rankings in the world in terms of education are worse now than they were when I was a kid. And they weren't great back then either. But it's because we're holding dear to the way things were done in 1900. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Oh, the education system in America always makes me laugh. No offense to Americans out there. I'm just like, it boggles my mind. Like, I understand national pride and things like that, but there's also ignorant, blind faith in the country that you have, right? Like this idea that you can't improve, you can't be the best and still improve. Like no 100%. One would say, New England Patriots wouldn't say, yeah, we played a perfect season, right? Obviously it's the same thing with a country.
Yeah.
And that mindset's always boggling me. But I also like that you said you had a podcast with your dad. Was it about mental health too?
It was. So he on mine, I do a couple different interviews per episode, and he was the shorter one. And so I was home visiting him about almost 2 months ago now, and I sat down with my microphones and we chatted for 15 minutes about the mental health of trying to make sure people are embraced in the workplace, which is where that topic about remote work came up. About his mental health in the workplace. He runs a company that he would say as a triple bottom line of people, place, and planet. No, that's not it.
People, planet, profit.
Thank you. That's it. I remember there was a third one in there. And so they're a chemical manufacturing company that, quite frankly, could make a lot more money every year, but they are wanting to make sure their chemicals are as environmental as possible, and making sure they're not doing a lot of emissions and all this kind of stuff. So it was really interesting to get that from him.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I interviewed my dad just under 2 months ago too, so I thought that was pretty cool.
That's awesome.
For my podcast. It's a fun time talking to your dad, eh?
Yeah, we had a good chat, yeah, it was really nice. I did that, and I also recorded my grandmother while I was home. As I said, when her husband died a year ago, and I wanted to get some family stories on tape so that we can preserve those.
That's beautiful. And now I wanted to get into kind of talking about why that problem is more focused on young men, like young boys, that sedation issue, because you mentioned that it does happen with young women, but it's mostly young men. Why is that a biological thing or is that a cultural thing?
Man, smarter people than me have a good answer for that. I can tell you from what I have sort of talked to people about, and that is that we are told to hold it in more than women. And that is incredibly harmful. And we're seeing that. I don't think there is a person alive who would say, oh, yeah, men, especially, unfortunately, white men are doing just fine. We're not. It's not going well. And it's our own damn fault. But at the same time, people have drilled it into us. Boys don't cry. Boys got to hold it in, and then you go, get in the ring or do, sports. Like, that's our outlet, right? And I was an athlete. I was a baseball player and a runner. And, I wish I was as mentally calm then as I am today. I would be a much better baseball player if I knew how to deal with my emotions and I wasn't going up there going, this is my opportunity to let it out every time I swing.
Yeah.
Because for your listeners who can't see this, I'm a very short guy, and I was trying to hit home runs because that's how I got rid of my my emotions every time I was in the batter's box. But it's a shame. It is, and it's really, we're starting to see a change there, but there's still a lot of harmful tentacles of this idea that grip men all the time. Let me give you an example. I was reading this article sometime early in COVID. It could have been 10 years ago. It could have been yesterday. Who knows? And it knocked me on my feet. Actually, I want to see if you can guess this. This will be fun.
Okay.
This article said they'd done a study, and 92, 95%, somewhere in there, of all male friendships revolve around 3 topics. Can you guess what those topics were?
Sex.
Women was 1. Yep.
Women.
Yeah.
Sports.
Sports is 2.
Money.
You're close, kind of. Actually, you're not close. I don't know why I said that. I was trying to be nice.
Okay. I was gonna cars.
No, it's media. So movies, TV, and if you include music, you've got 99%. Like, that's those top 4. And I like it. I was sitting in this coffee shop. So again, this was before COVID, and I sat back and like took a deep breath because it immediately occurred to me that this was true in my life. Right. I got married almost 2 years ago now. And I was thinking of all the guys that were my groomsmen, including my 3 brothers who were my best men. And I realized that this was how I operated with all of them. And it wasn't a conscious choice. I wasn't deciding, I'm not going to tell my closest male friends in the world about, my struggles. But when I think about the people that I was closest with in terms of sharing the most with, they were all women. And because I am more of an emotional guy, again, this is literally what I do for a living, and there's no line between what I do for a living and my wife knows this because I'm very open with her. We have a very open relationship, and I am that guy in work. I'm that guy at home, but I wasn't with my male friends, and so one by one, I text all of them. I said, "All right, new rule." I told them about what I just read. And I said, from now on, we're going to talk about those things because, quite frankly, I love my sports teams. And yes, talking about women is a good time. But we're also going to talk about real things. And so now my friends know if we talk about something that is sports, music, whatever, I'm then going to go, okay, how are you feeling? What's going on with your relationship? Whatever. And it's made a world of difference. And I'm really glad that I read that article for how horrible it made me feel that day.
Yep. Yeah. I totally relate to that. I mean, luckily I have a guy friend group that we like we talk our fair amount about our relationships and girlfriends and real life stuff. We don't really keep a lot of it a secret. Some of the guys I've actually had on my podcast, so that's helped a lot too. But it is interesting that I always say that too, and I feel much easier going to my girlfriends to open up about things. And that makes me think, are my other guy friends like that too? Like, do they also go to their girlfriends to talk about things? Like, why don't we do it together? Why don't we open up a little bit more? Because, is it the guys not making each other feel safe? Is it just the idea that we might get embarrassed, or this is not something that guys talk about? Fortunately, I have a guy group that doesn't care. And we get deep sometimes in like the driveway or in the car, like before getting dropped off. So shout out to those guys.
That's awesome, man. But you are the lucky, rare guy who has that, right? And I will say, I don't want your listeners to think that I snapped my fingers and it was perfect, right? Some of my guy friends still struggle with this, and one in particular, he and he's one of my closer friends, but he's just more of a reserved guy, anyways. And we share a very deep love for Star Wars. This is like a huge thing in both of our lives. And it's what we talk about a lot of the time, but he knows after 3 or 4 or 5 straight, back and forth about whatever we're reading, I'm going to go and how's your wife? How's work going? Talk to me about that. And it's harder for him, but he's gotten way better at it with me. And I don't know, again, if it was just he didn't feel comfortable doing that with me before, or if this was foreign to him to talk about, how things deeper were going on with him. But it's gotten to a point now where he is not nearly as hesitant to let me in conversations.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful thing. I think some people are work in progress because they come from a family that doesn't talk about that kind of thing. And then there's others that, I'm pretty open. I've always been pretty open. It was always harder for me when I was younger because there was less people that seemed to be open, and I felt like ahead of a lot of them. And when I was in university, I'm like, man, all these guys are so shallow. Like they only talk about sports and women and like when I say women, it's just like, I slept at this woman's place and we after the bar and it was good time. Not like, oh yeah, how's your relationship with your girlfriend?
Yeah.
As you like, there's different kinds of talking about women, right?
As our president would say, locker room talk.
Yes, and which is probably part of that. Whenever I hate that term,
I do too.
Like locker room talk, for the most part, what that I experienced wasn't that bad. But I was also part of locker. You know exactly what they're talking about when they say locker room talk, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that goes. Those are the types of toxic things that spread to. I mean, it's not just sports. If you think about the cop system or the police system, it's the same thing there. Like every lawyers, finance, like a lot of the workplace. I don't know why we just subjugate it to sports when it's just basically any community of men.
it's bros, and I think that there's a lot. It takes me back to I'm 34, and I grew up a huge hip hop fan and hardcore rap, and there was a saying in rap back in the 90s and early 2000s that then became popular, went everywhere, and it was no homo, which is a really horrible thing when you think about it, that men would rather be homophobic than appear even for a second to be vulnerable. Like that's what that expression means, is that you say I love you, man, and then immediately followed up with something as hateful as no homo. You're saying I was so afraid of appearing vulnerable to you, someone I care about, even for a second, that I'd rather be homophobic and hateful to follow that up. That's a horrible thing when you think about it.
I remember in high school, you'd hug a guy friend and then you say like no homo though. Yeah, that's true. It was bad. I didn't know that that's where it populated from.
Yeah, it started in rap in the late 90s. I can vividly remember Lil Wayne on one of his songs dropping that. And this was probably early 2000s. So yeah, it got big there, and then sort of, as most things do, get popular in the Black community, and then white people steal it, and it becomes a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely relatable there. But I think that's a perfect segue into talking about why, men struggle to talk about suicide, which is a topic I really wanted to talk about with you. Because I remember a time when, you know, it was maybe a darker time with some of some people in my life, and no one wanted to directly ask the question, are you feeling suicidal? And I mean, that is a hard question to ask of anyone, but it's especially hard when it's someone really close to you, and especially hard when you're a guy asking it to another guy. Like, why do you think that is? Where do you think that comes from?
Well, there's two answers to that. Number one, we have been taught erroneously for a long time that if you talk about suicide, more people will commit suicide. Here's the sad thing. First off, that's completely false. In fact, there's a lot of data that shows that's very false. The sad thing is that there's a kernel of truth in there. And that kernel of truth is the more the media reports on a method of suicide, the more you see copycats. And so they took this truth, right? A famous person commits suicide, you know, especially if it's something that has been glorified in some way. And then all of a sudden you see a rash of copycats of people doing it. And they took that kernel of truth and they extrapolated from it, oh, if we talk about suicide, more people will commit suicide, which is false and harmful and keeps people from talking about suicide. So that's number one. And I can't dispel that myth enough. There is so much data that shows that that is not true. Don't hesitate to talk about suicide because you think more people will do it. However, if you see a person in your life who happens to work in the media really getting into gory details about how this person took their own life, let them know how incredibly harmful that is. And by the way, there's nothing that needs, like, that doesn't need to be reported. What needs to be reported is this person's suffering. How they did it is just clickbait. And let's call that out. It is just clickbait. So that's number one. Number two, vulnerability is hard. For anyone, it's hard. I love my wife dearly. We've been married for almost 2 years. We've been dating now for over 4, or we've been together for over 4. I still at times struggle to tell her, you know, this is the closest person to me in my life. And I still struggle at times to tell her some of these deeper feelings because vulnerability is hard. And if you are talking to someone, as we just discussed, men are taught to hold this in. And you add on top of that, the male relationship has not been built for this because we've just never done it before. Asking someone the most vulnerable to be the most vulnerable they've ever been is really hard. And unfortunately, there's no secret there. The secret way to get someone to talk about how they're feeling is unfortunately just to get someone to talk about how they're feeling. There's no trick. The only thing that helps, as I say on my podcast all the time, vulnerability begets vulnerability and empathy begets empathy. And what that means is, and I've done this, I've had to use this, you know, if I'm interviewing someone and they're just a wall, the way you get someone to open up is not to keep pressing it because they're just going to keep retreating. The way you get someone to open up is you open up. If you tell someone, let's say you're talking to someone that you actually do think is, God forbid, considering taking their own life. The way to do it is to, first off, ask them how they're feeling. They're probably going to tell you they're feeling just fine. That's what we do. If you truly are concerned, don't follow that up with, oh, no, dude, I think you're lying to me or whatever, some BS. Tell them, hey, man, if you don't mind, I'm kind of struggling. Would you mind listening? Or can I tell you about what's going on in my life, right? Start talking to them in a way that lets them know, oh, this person gets it, right? This person understands. And it can be whatever. It can be, look, my wife and I are really fighting lately and this is what's happening. Or, God, I'm really still beat up because my grandfather died a year ago and I still am having grief sometimes, which is very normal. Everybody grieves differently. These are things that tells that person it's safe. This is a safe place for me to share. Once you do that, and then say, all right, so how are you feeling? What's going on with you? And then if they admit, yeah, I've been kind of down, it is 100% okay to say, have you ever thought about taking your life? Have you ever thought about suicide? Don't be afraid. Put it out there. And obviously we all want to cross our fingers and hope the person goes, oh man, hell no, I'd never do that, right? That's the best answer you can get in the world. But if they say, yeah, I've thought about it, or I've had those ideas, your follow-up is, oh man, I'm so sorry to hear that. Do you have a plan? Is there a method that you've considered? And again, hopefully the person says, no, I've just, I've been down and it's popped into my head. But if they say yes, this is the next. These are the steps, right? So if they say yes, I've considered hanging myself. I was going to shoot myself. You say, well, I'm so sorry to hear that. Do you have the gun? Do you have a rope? And you keep trying to give them a chance to tell you that they're not there yet. And if they keep saying, yep, I've got the rope. In fact, I've thought about doing it next Tuesday or something like that. That's when oh, this shit's real. I need to step in.
Yeah. No, it's very true. Like I took very minimal, it's called Safe Talk up here in Canada for one of my past roles. And I wasn't I wasn't trained to talk someone fully down, but I was trained to probe for those questions of like, do you have a plan in place? Because very rarely is suicide actually like instinctual, where it's just you have a feeling and you do it, right? Like there's typically a method to the madness. And I have had to ask 3 or 4 people, I guess, in my life about if they're suicidal, and it doesn't get easier. It's one thing where it does not get easier. It's like, but it's, what I always tell people, if there's this instinct on your heart and it's like pounding out of your chest, that means you have to do it. It doesn't matter. Like that means it's a like growth time, baby. Go in, go ask that hard question. Cause if you don't, and if something happens,
100%
on you for the rest of your life.
Yep. Yeah. And by the way, that never goes away. And both of those things you just said, the fear in that moment of asking someone you care about that question, you'll feel that every time. And if you don't, and something, God forbid, happens, and luckily I've never been in that situation, you will never forgive yourself, right? It's just, there is so much research on this. And this is from someone who, I stopped a suicide and it was the worst night of my life, and it still sits with me, and it's 10 plus years later, right? Mm-hmm. It is one of the hardest things you can do. And that might be surprising to some of your listeners to hear, oh my God, he saved a life. No, it's not like that. It's not like, diving in front of a bullet or something like that you've seen on TV. Sitting there in that moment of such raw hurt is a thing you don't get over. It is incredibly challenging, and it's a thing that it's not like I sit there and go, I'm so glad I did that. There's a person alive today. If it wouldn't be if it wasn't for me. It's instead what sits with you is I can't imagine. I unfortunately can, but for most people, I can't imagine being where that person was. And, because I myself had 6 months before this had attempted it twice, like I knew where they were at that moment, but it doesn't make it easier.
No. And that's one thing that I find really interesting, because I've never really had those thoughts or mental health. I've had that kind of moment or flash before my eyes. It's like, oh, if I was to go, I'd jump in front of a bus, but never been like super serious about actually going down that path or having a reasoning of why I do it or wanting to actually end my life. It's just like a thought that pops in and then it pops right back out. And I think that's normal. I don't know for anyone else out there that's listening, tell me or not if that's normal. But I have friends who are on the mental health, and I do worry about them sometimes. But they typically, hopefully, if they've been through therapy, they know that structure, how to talk themselves down at that point. And it is still a huge fear. I there's nights that I won't ever leave my mind, even though nothing happened. There was huge warning signs that something was going to happen. And those are nights that stay in my mind forever, even though nothing happened, even though I'm fortunate to still have those friends with me today. Even those moments don't really leave your mind. And it's hard to even talk about that sometimes as a guy, even though you don't go through that, it's hard to process the fact that someone else might take their life.
Yeah, look, it It is quite so my attempts, right? I it's like I am so sorry for it now that I like it's almost absurd to me, but I did it 2 nights in a row. I poured out what I thought would be a lethal dosage of the drugs that I was addicted to on my computer. And then I called a friend to tell her what I was going to do. This was one of my closest friends in the world at the time. She texted a couple of friends of mine who rushed over to stop me. And the next night, learning from my mistakes the night before, I took the pills and then I called the same friend. And to put her through this 2 nights in a row, we're like still friendly. She doesn't live anywhere close to me, and we talk on occasion. But there will be times where I will just text her the words "thank you," and at this point, she knows, right? She knows what's going on. It means that I'm feeling horrible that I did this to her. And we've talked about trying to get a time where we can sit down and chat for the podcast, and that is a thing we would love to do when the world reopens, is to kind of walk through this together, But I can never say thank you enough to her. That is one comes anywhere close to being enough, but number two can take away the hurt that I did that night. So I understand the reluctance because that person is in a place where if they are truly considering doing this, they are in a place of such sheer hopelessness that it is hard to see anything. Like you're in such a deep hole that you aren't seeing the top anymore. You're so far down that all you see around you is the sides of the hole. So I get it, the fear and of reaching out, because there is something of a there by the grace of God go I feeling that is hard to break, right? If you look down into that hole and you see that person's no different from you, that's a scary feeling. But at the same time, as we say in this business, and this is why I always tell people to reach out, there is somebody in your life who will jump into that hole with you. I guarantee you. And if you truly don't believe that there's anyone in your life, I say this anytime I get interviewed, call me. You can find my information on my website. If you truly need someone to talk to, I'm here. And I say that because we have a saying in this industry, and that is, we'd rather spend 2 hours talking to you today than 2 hours at your funeral tomorrow. So reach out. I guarantee you the people in your life feel that way. No matter how much hurt, is going on there, I can promise you with 100% certainty, the people in your life who care about you feel the exact same way.
Yeah, no, it's really true. And I've been on this journey for myself as well to understand how to talk to people that are going through mental health issues or have mental illness. And one of the things that they talk about a lot is, one of the things that pisses me off so much is whenever I see things on Instagram talking about how to handle your anxiety, and there's like basic things like, oh, if you hit your snooze alarm twice, you're probably have anxiety, or like just these like really broad scope, just like no information ideas. And they're like, and so people get these ideas from these graphics on Instagram that they have anxiety or depression. And I'm like, this is a really dangerous way to go. And I always send these to my friends with actual diagnosed mental health illnesses, and they say, I hate these posts. Like, they have no idea what it's like. This is not what depression looks like. And I understand it looks different for everyone, but that's really not what it looks like. And I think we had that kind of initial conversation, but self-diagnosis right now seems to be a huge problem where people aren't going to doctors or psychiatrists and therapists to get diagnosed. What have you seen of that in the industry and in the world right now?
Oh man, we could talk about this for a long time. So there's sort of two ways to go with this. Number one, we need more mental health care in the U.S., right? I just wrote something about this the other day because there was a young man in Philadelphia who was murdered by the cops while going through a mental health moment of struggle. The police had been to his house 4 times that day because that's our system here in the United States. And then they shot him dead in front of his family. Wow. And I was writing about this because when you see in the United States, when you see these mass shootings or horrible situations, the first thing that people say is, "Oh, it's not a gun issue; it's a mental health issue," and then yet they don't do anything about mental health. Right? It is mental health is the always a bridesmaid that tips over the cake and gets wasted at the reception, never the bride. It's what everyone blames, but it never gets it never gets the help it needs. So, in one sense, self-diagnosis makes sense because a lot of people can't go see mental health professionals. So that's one side. On the other side, the proliferation of information about this without any context has made it so that a lot of people think they have things that they don't. Mental health is a spectrum, right? We are getting away from this thinking that if you fall in this bucket, you got this. If you fall in this bucket, like that's not how this shit works. Quite frankly, that's just not how it works. In fact, I was reading this fascinating article not long ago about how psychologists are starting to treat people with what used to be called borderline personality disorder the same way as if they have bipolar disorder. Because if you're 99% the same, why would you treat them differently just because they're missing that 1%, which makes a lot of sense. And it helps you understand that this shit's a spectrum. I may be here and you're right here, and we're going to have a lot of things in common, but we're also going to have a lot of things very, very different. So we don't do enough education about this. And again, I'm only talking about the U.S. You guys could be living in a mental health utopia. I have no idea. But in the U.S., we have PE, where physical education class, where we get to go run around and learn how to climb a rope and play baseball. We have health class, where if you're lucky, you get to learn about what goes in your body and how it transforms, your energy. And maybe, again, if you go to a more progressive school, sex ed, we don't have any mental health training. So there's no training how to spot anxiety or what to do about anxiety. There's no training on mindfulness. There's no training about depression. There's no training about what to do if you think you may have a serious issue of mental health. There's no training. And so you add all of this together and you get this rash of people deciding, oh, I've got this thing and I'm going to treat it the way that I saw on Instagram, which is by drinking a bottle of wine and calling it self-care.
Oh, I hate that. My dad has a pet peeve too of like when in movies they always show the man's vice as sex or alcohol as a running away from facing their problems. I mean, I just like to see a movie once show a dude journaling. That'd be really nice, like as a way to heal or recover. Maybe I have a goal and a dream to screenwrite a movie about this kind of thing, masculinity in the future. So maybe I'll include that in there. But I hate that. And when I use that same approach in university. It was always worried me throughout my university days too. Is I would see friends get a really bad mark, and then they'd respond by getting plastered that night and getting super wasted. I'm like, I don't know what life you're living right now, but that is not a healthy way to recover. And for me, whenever I drank, it was always, this is something I want to do. It's not because I'm searching for something else or searching for happiness. I've never drank like that in my entire life. Like I never have, I would never plan to. Celebratory is different than if it's a crutch. The very different ways to approach it. And you're right. We call it self-care and self-love. And this, I want to have a full episode on this in the future of self-love is progress, is admitting to yourself that you're not perfect, is admitting to yourself that you can be better. For me, one of the biggest things that I have in my life is that I'm overweight and I'm like not as fit as I could be. So as much as people celebrate all these male models that are overweight, I'm like, why are we celebrating something that's unhealthy? As a bigger dude, there's body positivity, and then there's delusion. So for me, I would, I love myself, but loving myself means that I should be able to admit to myself that I should do a diet and eat healthier to lose weight, not that I should stay in this unhealthy body forever. And we have confused the self-love like generation almost with being like, I'm okay the way I am. No, you alluded to it earlier. Change is the only constant in life. There's nothing wrong with changing. Changing is self-love. It's part of the process a lot of the time.
Well, I've never seen you in person, but I think you're a very beautiful man, and you know,
Thank you.
the
I just got a
hair,
haircut.
yeah, well, the hair's working for you. That's
Perfect.
really, it's really going well. I'm also overweight, and I think that there is some portion of both of the things you were saying. Like number one, I, as I like to joke, I work out 5 days a week to look like this. So, like there is a sense of, yes, I could go on some fad diet. I could try to work out harder, I guess. But the point is, I do all that to look this way. You know what I mean? I can't imagine what I would look like if I didn't. And so there is a finding a happy median there in
Yes.
the middle.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. Like self-love, important. Love yourself, but love yourself to the point where you're healthy and in every way, whether that's mental health, physical health, that is a process, that is a part of self-love, not drinking to avoid the pain as a vice. So
Yeah,
I wanted to add my 2 cents there.
No, that's a really important. That last piece is really important. That mindfulness is a thing that we have come to associate almost one-to-one with meditation. And it's like I'm going to get this wrong, but is it all squares or rectangles, and not all rectangles are squares? Whatever the case is.
All squares are rectangles, not all rectangles are squares.
Right. So meditation is a form of mindfulness. Not all mindfulness is meditation. And so journaling is a great one, as you mentioned, but a big piece of mindfulness is simply an awareness, right? And if you are constantly drinking and you're telling yourself, "Oh, I'm celebrating," or I do this because X, Y, and Z, whatever, and in reality, that little voice in the back of your head is going, "You're full of shit. You're full of shit." That being aware of that and saying to that little voice, "Fuck it, you're right," that's mindfulness. Being conscious is your mindfulness. So there are ways to practice it, and that's what people do when they are meditating, is getting in touch with that honesty, with that consciousness. So yes, if you're lying to yourself every night about why you're drinking, you may have a problem. You may also just need to take a step back and go, all right, let's do some self-reflection here. Why am I really doing this?
Yeah. And I always tried to question my friends without calling them alcoholics to their face in university when they did that. But one of the last topics I wanted to talk to you about was popularization versus normalization of mental health. This is something that I've come to terms with or thought about recently. Maybe in the last month, I've kind of had this question in my head, but I feel like we are popularizing mental health to an unhealthy degree, which is why we have people self-diagnosing. We have people wanting to have a mental health so they can relate to more people or seem cool. It seems like an in thing right now to be that. And normalization would just say, yeah, we have this in society. It's a problem. We need to address it, as you were talking about. Do you see that as an issue? Like, do you understand where I'm going with that question? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because there is a sense of where is the line between somebody actually thinking, damn, I think I have, maybe struggling with this thing, or I don't know, all their friends have it. It's like, when I was a kid, all of my friends were switching from glasses to contacts, and I had to switch from glasses to contacts, even though for the first 6 months of having contacts, my mother had to put them in for me because I couldn't touch my own eye. So there is a sense there where it's like, all right, do you really want this, or are you just trying to fit in? And fitting in is never a good thing. Take it from a guy who stands the hell out everywhere I go. And I do. I'm that guy who walks around going, this is me. I don't really give up, But there is something to be said about the normalization piece. That's super important. And that's what I try to do with my speaking, with my podcast. We need to get rid of the stigma around this. And if that means, unfortunately, going through a bit of an overcorrection, there's a problem. Don't get me wrong, but which is worse, And right now, we're still in a lot of places just not talking about mental health, not talking about substance misuse. Drug use has been like this forever, right? You don't tell your kids about drugs; they're never going to use drugs, which is we proved that not to be true with sex, right?
Yeah.
You don't tell them about sex, they're not going to have sex. No, you don't tell them about sex, they're still going to have it. They're going to do it in a stupid way. It's the
Yep.
same thing with drugs. And we just have to normalize talking about these things so things happen safer. And that the popularization piece I see as an overcorrection. For a long time we didn't talk about these things. Now we are, and it's we've swung too far in the opposite direction. But if we start having these honest conversations and we make it, okay, this is literally what it means to struggle with depression, maybe some of these people who say I struggle with depression will realize, oh, I don't have that, and I have empathy for those people that do.
I think that there's a piece of it too, because overcorrection is obviously bound to happen. I think they're both dangerous, but you're right in that I think it will correct at some point. I just look at it and I'm like, if you haven't gotten a diagnosis from a trained professional, I really have no interest in hearing what I'll be empathetic to what you're talking about, but I won't agree that you have a mental health issue or a mental illness until you go to the doctor, because I'm not going to perpetuate that popularization, or I'll normalize it to the fact that, yeah, you should go see a therapist and get that, I guess, initial idea. But like, don't come to me saying, yes, you are mentally sick. And I don't know. I couldn't do that like internally in my heart,
So there's a do you ever watch the show Scrubs?
I did not, but I know the name.
So big fan.
And the song. I know No Scrubs.
Also a great song. There's an episode on that show where a great Canadian, actually, Michael J. Fox, comes on, a wonderful Canadian, comes on the show, and they use the fact that he's suffering. It's Parkinson's, right? Isn't that what?
Yeah, the one where she's shaking.
Yeah. So they use that and they play into it, and he talks about in the show he has OCD, and they actually do it pretty well, which is a thing to say because a lot of times OCD is played up. It's just like, again, as a guy with OCD, the way they do it in a lot of movies and TV is pretty horrible. They did it pretty well in Scrubs, but there's a moment where he's talking to someone and he's doing all his stuff, and the guy goes, kind of, what are you doing? And he goes, oh, I've got OCD. This is what it means. He goes, oh, my grandfather suffered from that. He used to beat us every night with a sack of nickels. And then he looks at him and goes, OCD, right? And Michael J. Fox is like, no, that's not OCD. And so I think that there is a piece of that where it's like things are done in the name of, oh, I've got mental health issues. And it's like, but do you, or are you just an asshole?
Yep.
And there's definitely a piece of that. Although I would also say that being an asshole may be in itself a mental health issue.
I love that you said that, because I've had conversations with people where they duck out of things that they should be accountable for, and they should be adult enough to overcome. I'm like, your mental health issues or whatever doesn't give you the power to abuse that reasoning about why you're affecting someone else's mental health, because you're just shying away from a conversation. Conflict or having real conversations is not a mental health thing. That you should be able to control it enough to be an adult to have that conversation in the first place.
Well, or if you can't, tell the person why, and then just have them reach out to me, and we can have that conversation instead.
Yeah, that's great. And I liked what you said there too about being like on the show OCD, because I'm thinking now about a TikTok I watched where this girl is like, this is what having anxiety actually looks like, and she's just sitting there.
Yeah,
she's just sitting there, and she's like, in the movies they make it play it up to like, oh, this guy with anxiety or ADHD is like literally moving the entire time, fiddling with everything. What are your thoughts about the media portrayal of mental health?
Well, so I think there's a wide spectrum. There's a lot of people that have done it really well, and you see all these lists of places that have really expertly captured mental health and substance misuse. And then there's also a lot of places that don't do it well. And I actually I'm that asshole that reaches out to places that I do like, right? If it's something I don't care about, if Marvel was a dick about mental health, whatever. But if I like a podcast, I've done this a lot where I really like a podcast, and then they say something that's hurtful or whatever the case is, I'll reach out and say, hey, love the podcast. In fact, as a fellow podcaster, would love to chat sometime, by the way. However, as someone with struggles with mental health and also with or substance misuse, whatever the case is, let me tell you how you were off when you said this. And if you'd ever want to chat, I would love to talk to you. And I've had people respond very kindly, like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I've had people go, you have no idea what you're talking about. My friend's friend, whatever. That's fine. Do your thing. I've also done that for work. I had someone reach out and say, would you mind advising on this? And I said, would love to. So, it's a conversation that I try to approach as, look, I'll be quite frank, I know 1,000 times more about this than you do. I don't think you meant to be harmful. I would love to chat about how you can do better in the future. And when people respond kindly, it's usually wonderful.
Mm-hmm. So before you go, what is one thing that you'd want to leave men with when discussing mental health for themselves and others?
Yeah. So number one, as I've said now a couple of times, but I can't say it enough, and that's just reach out. There are people in your life who care. If you are struggling, the age of struggling in silence, as I like to say, is over because we've decided that it's over. There is somebody in your life who would love to listen. So number one, reach out. Also, you'll be surprised if you go, no, none of my guy friends. You will be surprised. There are people who are secretly very into this and just don't feel comfortable. Maybe they don't feel comfortable talking to you about it. There's a guy that I've been working with as I coach one-on-one, and he's the type of, he loves Joe Rogan and all that kind of stuff. And I would not think, I thought it was going to be pulling teeth with this guy. And the minute we get into our sessions, it's like night and day. And just because he doesn't feel that he has the people in his life to do that work with. And so that's, where I come in. But I guarantee you there is someone in your life who would love to get real with you. If it takes them a drink to open up, okay, not the healthiest thing, but if that's how it gets done, that's how it gets done.
Yeah.
So reach out to somebody. But also going back to my original point, because I think it's so important. Empathy begets empathy, and vulnerability begets vulnerability. If you want someone to be there for you, chances are you got to take the first step. Tell them, reach out, tell them, hey man, this has happened in my life. Do you have any, do you mind just listening? Can we just chat? And I guarantee you, maybe not that day, but very soon after, someone's going to reach out to you, and that person is going to go, hey, do you got a second? Because they're going to know that you're a person they can do that with.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a beautiful, beautiful message. And it's the same way of like, just know that it allows them to know that the space is safe. And, I believe that that's how I've done some of the conversations on my show is, I'm happily opening up about masculinity and manhood in myself and sharing the vulnerable pieces of me, which allows other people and the people I talk to connect with me. And we have conversations about that. So I can say in theory and in practice that one works. But Jay, where can people find you? What do you have going on in your life? And how can I promote you for the next minute or two?
Well, thanks, man. This was fun. Not always easy, but fun. I am wrapping my first season of the podcast right now. It's the last episode will drop the first week of December. I will then take a very much needed month off from the podcast, and season 2 will start in January. You can find it anywhere you get your podcast. Choose Your Struggle is the name. Look, if you think you've got a story, if you know someone that you think I should talk to, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me at my website, jayshifman.com, which is JAYSHIFMAN.com. And all your social medias are Jay Shifman or Choose Your Struggle. I'm the same everywhere.
Perfect. Well, Jay, thank you so much for joining me on the Imperfect Pod. Imperfect listeners, I hope you got a lot to take away from it. Mental health is something that I don't think you can talk about enough, and it's something that I haven't really touched on a full episode. So that's why I really wanted to do it here with Jay today. So Jay, thank you so much.
Luke, it was great being here, and to all your listeners, keep listening to this show, because anyone willing to have conversations about these topics is a good one in my book.
Thank you everyone so much for listening to this week's episode of the Imperfect Pod. If you would like to find out more about today's guest, you can connect with him on Facebook at Choose Your Struggle, on Instagram at Jay Shifman, on LinkedIn at Jay Shifman, and website jshifman.com. As always, links in the description below. If you enjoyed the episode, it would mean the world to me if you press the follow button, subscribe button, or left a review and donated to Gautam's Movember fundraiser. If you would like to discuss today's topic, please feel free to message me on Instagram at The Imperfect Pod, or connect with me on LinkedIn at Luke West, or email Luke at theimperfectpod.com to continue the conversation. Also, we do have another episode coming out Friday, and it's going to be a kind of a continuation or another episode about mental health, because I thought, Movember, and these are really important conversations to have. That one's a little bit less totally focused on mental health, but the guest is the founder of a mental health app, which is doing amazing work in this time. So check that out, and I'll see you on Friday.
Y'all know that I love CBD, and almost since day one of this podcast, I've been lucky enough to be sponsored by Mountain Made. And while my wife and I swear by their full spectrum CBD chewables, sometimes at the end of the day, I need just a little bit more to help me relax. So when my wife is joining me, I pull out a Mountain Made puff, and those are awesome. But when it's just me, they're just a little bit more than what I'm looking for. So what do? I throw a couple of hits from Boston Hempire into my bowl, and it's the perfect way to end the day. Boston Hempire has the finest loose leaf CBD flower and some pretty cool edibles too. So when I add it to everything I'm using from Mountain Made, it is the perfect complement. If you check out Boston Hempire using the link in my show notes or my podcast website, you will be helping out the podcast as well as getting some of the finest CBD flower on the market. So check it out today.